She always said she wanted to protect me, but can you protect with lies? My wife, Mavis, turned out to be the key to the plans of the dangerous Jared, and now I know that our entire marriage was just a game. Her betrayal and the video that opens my eyes to the truth forced me to act. But now the question is, can I trust her to destroy the enemy together? This is our last chance. How will it all end? Julian sat at the kitchen table, clutching a cup of cold coffee. His eyes were fixed on a message displayed on his phone. Your wife will be at the club soon. I know everything. The number was unknown, but the words struck him like a dagger. He reread them over and over, as if searching for a hidden meaning. His wife, Mavis, always had a mysterious side, but Julian now felt this was more than just work or her habit of staying late at clubs. This must be a mistake, he muttered under his breath, but his heart tightened with unease. He dialed Mavis's number again, but she didn't answer. His fingers drummed the table instinctively as chaotic thoughts raced through his mind. What are you hiding? He asked himself softly. Mavis worked as a DJ in the city's most popular nightclubs. Her energy and charm drew in crowds, and Julian had always supported her career. But something had changed. She'd become distant, often dodging his questions and coming home later and later. She called it just work, but Julian felt there was more to the story. Determined to uncover the truth, he grabbed his keys and headed to the club. His heart raced with every step, and the doubts in his mind grew louder. Walking into the club, Julian was met with pounding music and flashing lights. He despised places like this, but couldn't afford to care about his discomfort now. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar figure. And then he saw her, standing by the bar. Mavis was with a younger man, laughing, her hand resting on his shoulder. Julian froze, feeling a surge of anger and heartbreak. The man leaned in and whispered something into Mavis's ear. She nodded, smiling, a smile Julian once knew so well. How could you? He muttered, his voice lost in the deafening music. He stepped back, overwhelmed by what he had seen. Confronting her right now wasn't an option. That wasn't his style. But he couldn't just stand there, either. Deciding to leave, he glanced at Mavis one last time. She was dancing now, her movements carefree, her face glowing with joy. The man held her close, and she didn't resist. Julian left the club, his chest tight with pain. He couldn't understand why this was happening. Had he done something wrong? Had she stayed with him only for stability? Had she ever truly loved him? Back home, Julian sat in the dark, wrestling with what to do next. His love for Mavis was deep, but now it felt like a poison slowly consuming him. He replayed every moment she had avoided his gaze, ignored phone calls, and dodged his questions. It all fit into a grim picture now. The next morning, Julian was at the kitchen table when Mavis walked in, looking cheerful, as if nothing had happened. Good morning, she said, kissing him on the cheek. How are you? Good morning, he replied curtly, avoiding her eyes. She began talking about her busy night, but Julian barely listened. His mind was consumed with finding answers. This time, he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. Because I was one of those she recruited, and now I want to put an end to it. Those words exploded in Julian's mind. He realized this was only the beginning of his path to the truth. Are you saying my wife works for Jared Loquin and recruits people for his schemes? Julian could hardly believe what he was hearing. His voice was tense, but anger and disappointment brewed inside him. And how am I supposed to process this? Eliza held his gaze. Her eyes were serious, but there was a flicker of unease in them. I know it's hard to hear, but I'm telling the truth, she said, lowering her voice. If you want to understand what's really going on, you need to hear me out. Julian stayed silent for a few seconds, weighing her words. His heart was racing so hard it felt as if he could hear it. Finally, he exhaled and nodded. Go on, he said curtly. Eliza glanced around, checking if anyone was listening, then continued. Jared is a dangerous man. He owns a network of clubs, but that's just a front. In reality, he's involved in money laundering and illegal business deals. Mavis became a part of this world before you even got married. She's not just a DJ. She's one of those who lures clients into his traps. Sometimes it's just businessmen looking for entertainment, but often, it's people he can exploit for his dirty schemes. That's nonsense. Julian raised his voice, but immediately calmed himself as a few cafe patrons turned to look. He leaned closer to Eliza, speaking through clenched teeth. Why should I believe you? Because I can prove it, she said, pulling out her phone. She opened her gallery and showed him several photos. In them, Mavis was sitting in a club with different men. In some, they looked uncomfortably close. In others, Jared was nearby. One photo showed Mavis handing him an envelope, and his smile suggested he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. Julian's hands trembled as he looked at the images. He turned to Eliza and asked coldly, "Why haven't you gone to the police?" Eliza sighed. Because Jared controls everyone. He has people in law enforcement, and if you go to them, he'll know immediately. I tried, but all I got were subtle warnings to back off. That's when I decided to find you. You're the only one who can influence Mavis. She can stop this. And if I don't? Julian leaned back, struggling to contain his emotions. What if I just walk away and forget all of this? Eliza shook her head. You can't. Because Jared already knows about you. You're her weakness. And if he thinks you're a threat, he'll use that against you. Walking away isn't an option, Julian. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He sat on the living room couch, gripping his phone. His eyes were fixed on one of the numbers Eliza had given him, a person she said could confirm everything. But he couldn't bring himself to call. Instead, he replayed their conversation in his mind, unable to stop thinking about what she'd said about Mavis. How did I not see this sooner? He whispered to himself. His mind refused to accept that Mavis could be so deeply involved in something like this. It was 2 a.m. when the door opened. Mavis walked in, visibly tired but calm, even cheerful. She noticed him sitting there and froze. "You're still up?" she asked, tossing her bag onto the chair. "No," he replied tersely, without looking at her. Mavis walked closer and sat beside him. Her hand touched his shoulder, but he moved away. "What's wrong, Julian?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. He finally looked her in the eyes. His gaze was heavy, filled with bitterness. "Have you ever told me the truth, Mavis?" His voice was cold, almost unfamiliar. She flinched. "What are you talking about?" "About your job. About Jared. About all of it," he said, standing abruptly, his movements restless. "I know everything, Mavis, and I need the truth. Just tell me." Her face froze for a moment, but she quickly masked it with her usual calm expression. "Julian, you don't understand. It's more complicated than you think." "Then explain," he shouted, his patience wearing thin. "Explain why I'm getting messages from people claiming you're involved in dirty schemes. Why I see you in photos with Jared Loquin. Why you keep lying to me." Mavis sighed deeply and lowered her head. "I wanted to protect you," she said softly. "Everything I do for us." "Protect me?" Julian couldn't hold back a sarcastic laugh. "Do you even hear how that sounds? What does that even mean?" Mavis raised her eyes, glistening with tears. "Jared controls me. He knows I could lose everything if I go against him. But you don't need to get involved. Just let me handle this on my own." "On your own?" Julian laughed again. But this time his laughter was bitter. "You've already handled it, haven't you? Look where we are now." He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, but her voice was weak. "To find the truth you won't tell me," he said, slamming the door behind him. The cold air outside immediately cooled his anger. Julian pulled out his phone and, with a deep sigh, dialed the number from the paper Eliza had given him. The call was brief. "Hello?" a man's voice answered. "This is Julian. I was told you could help me figure out what's going on with Jared Loquin." There was a pause on the other end before the man replied. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. The old warehouse on the edge of town. Come alone." The call ended, leaving Julian with an even heavier burden of doubt. Tomorrow could change his life forever, but he knew there was no turning back. "If you show up there, you might not come back," Eliza had said, her voice full of concern. Julian, clutching his phone, averted his gaze and sighed deeply. Her words echoed in his mind, but he felt he had gone too far to back down now. "I can't just sit and wait," he replied, not looking at her. I need the truth, no matter how ugly it is. Eliza stepped closer, her worry evident in her eyes. You don't understand who you're dealing with, she said. Jared isn't just a businessman. He controls everything. If he suspects you're threatening his plans, he won't hesitate. And I won't hesitate to stop him, Julian replied firmly, standing up. This isn't a game, Julian, she almost yelled. I've seen what he does to people who go against him. They either disappear or end up in jail on charges he fabricated. So you want me to just sit by and let it continue? He turned to her, his eyes blazing with anger. No, Eliza. If I do nothing, it'll never stop. Eliza fell silent for a moment, her expression filled with despair. She realized convincing him was impossible. Then let me go with you, she said quietly. What? Julian froze in surprise. If you're going to meet Jared or his people, you need to know what to expect. I can help. I know their methods. You want to go with me? That's dangerous, Eliza. And staying on the sidelines is even more dangerous, she replied confidently. I've already made my choice. Julian took a deep breath, considering her words. On one hand, he didn't want to risk Eliza's life, but on the other, her knowledge could be crucial. Fine, he said at last. But if anything goes wrong, I want you to leave immediately. No hesitation. Deal? Eliza nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. Deal. The next morning, they met on the outskirts of town. The warehouse Julian had been directed to looked abandoned, an old building with peeling walls and rusted doors. The area was deserted, save for the wind scattering dust along the road. It's a trap, Eliza said quietly, scanning the building. Maybe, Julian replied, gripping his phone in his pocket, but I don't have a choice. They approached the door, and Julian knocked 3 times as instructed. After a few seconds, the door creaked open, revealing a man in a dark suit with an unreadable expression. Julian, I presume? He asked dryly. Yes, that's me, Julian replied, trying to keep his composure. And clearly, you're not alone, the man said, glancing briefly at Eliza but saying nothing more. Come in. They stepped inside. The warehouse looked even grimmer than it had from the outside. Bare walls, a few old crates, and a long table in the center of the room, where 2 men were seated. Sit, one of the men ordered without lifting his head. Julian and Eliza sat across from them, the tension in the air almost palpable. So, you want to know the truth, said the gray-haired man seated in the middle. His voice was low and calm, but carried an underlying threat. Do you really think you're ready to hear it? I'm ready, Julian replied firmly. The man smirked slightly. Good. Then I won't waste time. Your wife, Mavis, works for us, but not in the way you think. What does that mean? Julian interrupted. She doesn't just recruit clients. She's one of the closers. Her role is far more critical than you could imagine. And I'm sure you won't like what that entails. Julian felt his hands ball into fists. And what exactly are these deals? The man leaned forward, locking eyes with Julian. Money laundering, blackmail, information leaks. All the little things that make our lives interesting. She couldn't have done this, Julian said quietly, though his voice was uncertain. The truth hurts, doesn't it? The man said with a thin smile. But that's not all. What do you mean? Eliza asked, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. Jared knew you'd come here, the man said calmly. And now, you both have a choice to make. What choice? Julian asked tensely. You either work with us, or you disappear. What do you think your wife will choose if she finds out you're jeopardizing her job? At that moment, Julian realized he'd walked into a trap. They knew everything about him, and were now using it against him. I need to see Jared, Julian said. I want to speak to him. The gray-haired man laughed. Jared doesn't speak with those who haven't proven their loyalty. But you can change that. How? Julian asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Bring him something valuable. Information, money, or a choice that convinces him you're on our side. Julian remained silent, feeling his world crumble around him. Eliza placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll find another way, she whispered. There is no other way, the man said coldly. You either play by our rules, or you don't play at all. Julian stood up, his gaze resolute. We'll see who's really making the rules here, he said, turning toward the door. The man laughed as he walked away. Good luck, Julian. You're going to need it. As they exited the warehouse, Eliza grabbed his arm. You're not seriously considering doing what they want, are you? No, he sighed. But now I know who I'm dealing with. And what now? She asked. Julian paused for a moment, then replied with confidence. Now we play by my rules. Play by your rules? Eliza stopped in the middle of the street, staring at Julian. Her voice was filled with disbelief. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Julian turned to face her, his expression cold and determined. Maybe I don't understand everything, but I do know one thing. If I play by their rules, I lose. And what are you planning to do? She asked, crossing her arms. Charge in head first? That's suicide. No, he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. But they made a mistake. They think they have me on a leash, but I can do the same to them. Eliza frowned, trying to understand his plan. Are you sure this will work? I don't have another choice, he said sharply. Are you with me or not? She hesitated for a few seconds, but finally nodded. Fine, she said. But if we're doing this, we need to act fast. Jared doesn't give people time to think. Julian's apartment was dark when they returned. He locked the door immediately, even though he knew it wouldn't make much difference if Jared wanted to get to him. What do we need? Eliza asked, sitting on the couch and pulling out her laptop. Information, he said shortly. Jared thinks he controls everyone, but every system has weaknesses. We need to find them. I can access his database, but it's risky, she said, typing on her keyboard. I still have access to some of his servers through my old account, but if they figure out it's me, we're in trouble. If we don't take the risk, we're already in trouble, Julian snapped, sitting beside her. You said you worked for him. What do you know? Eliza paused, lost in thought. His biggest strength is control over people. He collects dirt on them and uses it to force their cooperation. Everything, from minor infractions to major crimes. He documents it all. His system is airtight. There's always a gap in any system, Julian interrupted. We'll find it. Eliza sighed and continued typing. After a few minutes, she turned the screen toward Julian. This, she said, pointing to a folder labeled Personal. This is the database with all the blackmail material he has on his people. But only he has access to it. How can we get to it? Julian asked, leaning closer. We need someone in his inner circle. Someone with access to that folder. Julian ran a hand over his face, trying to focus. I have an idea, he said suddenly. Jared uses Mavis. If she's part of his scheme, she could be our key. You want to use her? Eliza raised an eyebrow. She's already involved, he replied. If we can convince her that Jared plans to get rid of her, maybe she'll help us. Eliza gave a faint, sad smile. And you're sure you can trust her? No, Julian said, meeting her gaze. But it's our only chance. Mavis was home when Julian returned. She sat in the kitchen, sipping tea and reading a book. Her face was calm, but Julian knew it was just a mask. We need to talk, he said, walking into the room. Mavis looked up. Did something happen? You're working for Jared, he said bluntly. Her expression shifted. She tried to hide her surprise, but she couldn't. I don't know what you're talking about, she replied, but her voice trembled. Stop lying, Mavis, he raised his voice. I know everything. Your meetings, your work, your deals. I know he's using you. It's not as simple as you think, she said, standing, her hands nervously gripping the edge of the table. Then explain it to me, he said sharply. Mavis sighed, as if resigning herself to a decision. If I tell you, you won't be able to go back to your normal life, she said quietly. This life stopped being normal a long time ago, Julian replied. Tell me the truth. She looked at him, and for the first time in a while, he saw a glimmer in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Jared has me on a leash, Mavis admitted, her voice trembling. He forced me to sign a contract making me responsible for everything he does in the clubs. If something goes wrong, I'm the one who goes to prison. Why would you agree to that? Julian asked, stunned by her confession. Because I thought I could control the situation, she replied, lowering her head. But I was wrong. You can help me stop him, Julian said firmly. That's impossible, she shook her head. Mavis, if you don't, he'll destroy you. He'll destroy us both. She looked at him with a mix of fear and hope. What do you want me to do? Do you have access to his data? Julian asked. She nodded hesitantly. I do, but I can't just take it. Everything is heavily secured. You can find a way, he insisted. Mavis stayed silent for a moment, but eventually nodded. Fine, she said quietly. But if this goes wrong, I won't forgive you. Julian met her gaze. We can't afford to fail. The next step would be critical, and their plan now hinged on whether Mavis could do her part. You have until morning, Mavis, Julian said, stepping back. His voice was firm, though he tried to remain calm. If you can't get access to Jared's data, we lose. Mavis nodded, but her tense expression hinted that she was holding something back. I'll do what I can, she replied softly, almost apologetically. Julian watched her for a moment, trying to read her thoughts, but said nothing. He turned and walked back to the living room, leaving her alone in the kitchen. Lying on the couch, Julian couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with suspicions. Something about Mavis's behavior felt off. She had agreed to help, but there was a hollowness in her words, a lack of sincerity. Suddenly, the sound of a notification caught his attention. Picking up his phone, he saw it wasn't for him. It came from an old tablet stashed in the closet. The tablet belonged to Mavis, and she seemed to have forgotten about it. Julian hesitated only for a moment. He opened the message. Tonight was incredible. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. See you tomorrow? The message was signed Ryan. Julian's heart clenched. He began scrolling through the message history. It was all there. Romantic texts, jokes, even pictures of Mavis and Ryan together. One photo showed them at the club where she worked. She was holding his hand, laughing, and he had his arm wrapped around her like she was the love of his life. Julian tossed the tablet onto the table, his breathing heavy, his hands trembling. How could you? He whispered, staring at the screen with hatred. At that moment, the door opened, and Mavis walked in. She saw him sitting there with the tablet in his hands, and her face darkened instantly. What are you doing? She asked, her voice shaking. What am I doing? Julian raised his head, his eyes blazing with fury. You tell me, Mavis. What is this? He threw the tablet onto the table, hard enough that it slid off and hit the floor. You read my messages? She asked, her face pale. Yes, I did, he said, his voice rising. And now I know everything. About you and Ryan. About how you betrayed me. Julian, it's not what you think, she began, but he raised a hand to stop her. Don't you dare say that to me, Mavis. His voice was low and firm. I saw everything. The photos, the messages. You've been lying to my face while you've been out with him. Mavis lowered her head, as if trying to hide from his piercing gaze. It was a mistake, she finally said. Mistake? He repeated, letting out a sarcastic laugh. This has been going on for months. This isn't a mistake, Mavis. It's betrayal. He took a step toward her but stopped, feeling his anger morph into disappointment. I loved you, Mavis, he said, his voice quieter but filled with pain. I defended you, even when I felt deceived. And now I find out that all this time, you've been with someone else? Mavis raised her head, her eyes brimming with tears. I never wanted you to find out, she confessed. I don't even know how it all happened. You don't know? Julian shouted. You know exactly how it happened. You made a choice, and you knew it would destroy us, but you kept doing it anyway. Mavis remained silent, as if she couldn't find the words to respond. I don't know what to do with you, he said finally, turning away. You betrayed me, and now I can't trust you. Julian, she took a step toward him, but he raised his hand to stop her. Don't come near me, he said quietly. Just leave me alone. He walked out of the room, leaving Mavis standing there, her face filled with despair. Julian sat in his car, parked near an old park. He stared at the empty path ahead, but his mind was elsewhere. He was trying to figure out what to do next. How can I trust her after this? He whispered to himself. He pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. His fingers hovered over the name Eliza. She was the only one who could help him now. After a few seconds, he pressed the call button. "Hello?" came her voice, sounding slightly surprised. "Eliza, it's Julian," he said. "We need to talk." "What happened?" she asked. "It's complicated," he replied. "But I think it's even worse than I thought." "Meet me at the same place in half an hour," she said without hesitation. "All right," he agreed and hung up. He sighed and started the car. His life was in chaos, and now he needed to find a way out of the darkness. But to do that, he needed to figure out who he could truly trust. "You should have seen this coming, Julian," Eliza said, eyeing him as they sat at the same table in the quiet cafe. She didn't end up in this game by accident. Mavis always knew what she was doing. Julian clenched his fist against the table. His thoughts were chaotic, and Eliza's words only added to the tension. "I don't even know what's real anymore," he admitted. "She betrayed me, that's clear. But was it part of her plan? Did she ever really love me?" Eliza sighed softly, resting her elbow on the table. "People who work for Jared always have multiple faces," she explained. "He doesn't give them a choice. They lie, they betray, they become someone else until their true self is completely gone." Julian lifted his eyes, and anger flared in his gaze. "Are you saying I was just another part of her facade? That she chose me because it was convenient for her and for Jared?" Eliza didn't answer immediately. Her silence spoke louder than words. "Listen," she finally said, leaning closer. "I know how much this hurts. But if you want to uncover the truth, you need to act rationally. Emotions won't help you here." Julian nodded, though he felt like he was being torn apart inside. He couldn't just ignore his feelings, but he also knew this wasn't the time for weakness. "What do we do next?" he asked, his voice quiet but resolute. Eliza pulled out a tablet and opened a map. "I have information about one of Jared's main locations," she explained. "It's a warehouse where he keeps documents and equipment. If we can get inside, we'll find everything we need." "Are you sure this will work?" he asked, watching her closely. "It's our best shot," she replied. "But it will be dangerous. Jared never leaves places like this unguarded." Julian ran a hand over his face, trying to collect himself. "If this is what it takes, I'm ready." Eliza nodded, then added, "One more thing. Mavis might still be useful." Julian frowned. "After what I've learned, I'm not sure I can trust her." "This isn't about trust," Eliza said coldly. "It's about using her connection to Jared. She knows his methods better than anyone else." Julian paused, considering her words before finally replying, "Fine, but if she betrays me again, I won't let it go unanswered." Julian returned home later that evening. The apartment was eerily quiet. Mavis was sitting on the couch, her expression tense. She looked up as he walked in. "You were with her, weren't you?" she asked, suspicion laced in her voice. "Yes," he replied bluntly, tossing his jacket over the back of a chair. "And what did she tell you?" Mavis sighed, as if bracing herself for the worst. "She said you can help," he said, sitting across from her. "I told you I'd do my best," she replied. "But will you?" Julian leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Or is this just another game, like your relationship with Ryan?" Mavis flinched at his words. "I already apologized, Julian." "Apologies won't change anything," he interrupted. "Right now, the only thing that matters is this. Either you help, or you're out of my life for good." She stayed silent, her eyes filling with tears. Eventually, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. "We know about Jared's warehouse," he explained. "We need access to his documents." Mavis hesitated for a moment, then replied, "It won't be easy. Everything is heavily guarded, and Jared implements new security measures every week." "But you can get in," Julian pressed. "Yes," she admitted, "but I'll need a reason. If I just show up without one, he'll know something's wrong." "Then come up with one," Julian said firmly. Mavis let out a heavy sigh but nodded. "All right, I'll do it." Later that night, Mavis went to the warehouse under the pretense of checking on equipment. Eliza and Julian waited in a car parked nearby, watching her every move. "Are you sure she'll go through with it?" Eliza asked, peering through binoculars. I'm not sure about anything, Julian replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Minutes felt like hours until Mavis finally emerged from the warehouse, looking tense but holding a small flash drive. She quickly got into the car and handed it to Julian. Everything you need is on here, she said. And now? Julian asked, passing the flash drive to Eliza. Now we make it work, Eliza replied, plugging it into her laptop. But as soon as she opened the files, her expression changed. It's a trap, she said sharply, pushing the laptop away. What? Julian asked, his voice tinged with alarm. These files are under surveillance. They already know we accessed them, she explained, hastily shutting the laptop. Mavis recoiled. I didn't know. I swear, she pleaded. We need to disappear now, Eliza said urgently. Julian started the engine, and they sped off. But a new plan was already forming in his mind. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. The car veered sharply into a narrow alley, the engine roaring through the stillness of the night. Julian gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Eliza sat in the passenger seat, typing furiously on her laptop, while Mavis silently clutched the seatbelt in the back. The tension in the car was palpable, like a taut string ready to snap. What now? Mavis finally broke the silence, her voice trembling though she tried to sound composed. Now? Julian shot her a quick, cold glance through the rearview mirror. Now we find out just how deep you're in. I did everything I could, she protested. I didn't know the files were being monitored. You didn't know? Or you didn't want to know? Eliza snapped, her eyes fixed on the screen. I wasn't lying this time, Mavis insisted. I really want to help. This time, Julian barked, slamming on the brakes and stopping the car near an abandoned gas station. Do you even hear yourself, Mavis? This time? How can I trust you after everything that's happened? Mavis lowered her eyes, saying nothing. Julian exhaled, trying to steady himself, then turned to Eliza. What do we have on the data? Eliza looked up briefly, then said, It's more complicated than I thought. Jared didn't just set us up. He's using this to lure us into a trap. If we leave it as is, he'll know our location within hours. Then we need to keep moving, Julian said, starting the engine again. Wait, Eliza stopped him. There's more. What is it? He asked, his voice tight with tension. There's something on the drive he wanted you to see, she said, turning the laptop toward him. On the screen was a video. The footage showed Mavis and Jared sitting at a table together. Her hand rested on his, and his voice was calm and assured. If anything goes wrong, you know what to do. Julian mustn't suspect a thing. Julian stared at the screen, unable to believe his eyes. Something inside him shattered. What is this, Mavis? He asked quietly, though his voice trembled with anger. It's not what you think, she began to defend herself. No, it's exactly what I think, Julian cut her off, turning to face her. All this time, you were on his side. All this time, you played the role of the loving wife while helping him destroy me. I was trying to protect you, she cried, tears streaming down her face. Protect me? He let out a cold laugh. You've only destroyed both of us. Eliza paused the video and turned to Mavis. Do you still think we'll believe you? You don't understand, Mavis said, clutching her head. He forced me. I had no choice. Julian was silent for a moment before stepping out of the car, slamming the door behind him. His mind was racing as he stared into the darkness, searching for answers. Eliza followed him. What are you going to do? She asked. Julian didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, I'm going to end this. Not for her, not even for me. To make sure this nightmare never happens again. Eliza looked at him with understanding and nodded. We'll do it together. When they got back into the car, Mavis was staring at the floor. She didn't even look up as they sat down. This is your last chance, Mavis, Julian said coldly. If you lie to us even once more, I won't hesitate to leave you behind. She nodded but didn't speak. Julian started the car and drove into the darkness. This was their final game, and the stakes had never been higher. What do you think motivates Mavis more? Fear of Jared, a desperate attempt to save herself, or lingering feelings for Julian?